The morning air was crisp, the city streets alive with hurried footsteps and honking horns. David adjusted his worn-out blazer, his fingers tightening around the strap of his old leather briefcase. This interview meant everything. It wasn't just another opportunity, it was his only shot at changing his life. Months of rejections, endless applications, and restless nights had led to this moment. If he landed this job, he could finally stop worrying about rent, stop choosing between dinner and the electric bill. He glanced at his watch. 9:35 a.m. He had exactly 25 minutes to reach the firm. It was a long walk, but he couldn't afford a cab, and the subway had delays. He picked up his pace, weaving through the morning crowd, his mind rehearsing potential interview questions. Then, he heard it. A sudden scream, sharp and desperate. David's head snapped toward the sound. Across the street, a woman was on the ground, her bicycle overturned, her ankle twisted unnaturally. A few people had stopped, but no one moved to help. Some gawked, others hesitated. His heart pounded. He didn't have time for this. If he stopped, he'd be late. If he was late, the opportunity was gone. Another pained cry. Without thinking, David rushed across the street, dodging traffic. He crouched beside the woman. She was young, no older than 30, with chestnut brown hair spilling over her face. Her breathing was labored, her hands trembling as she clutched her ankle. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice urgent yet gentle. She looked up at him, pain flickering in her green eyes. I think my ankle is broken." David swallowed hard, his stomach twisted. He should leave. He should apologize and walk away. But he couldn't. "Can you move it?" She winced as she tried, shaking her head. David stood. "We need to get you to a hospital." She blinked. I don't have my phone." He pulled out his own, dialing emergency services. He didn't have time to wait for an ambulance. "Do you trust me?" he asked, already kneeling to help her up. She hesitated, but something in his eyes, his sincerity, his urgency, made her nod. David lifted her carefully, her arm draping over his shoulder. She bit her lip, stifling a cry. He could feel her pain in the way her body tensed. Step by step, he guided her toward the nearest clinic a few blocks away. Each second that passed, his future slipped further away. The weight of it settled in his chest, but he kept moving. By the time they reached the clinic, David's shirt clung to his back, sweat beading on his forehead. He helped her into a chair, explaining the accident to the nurse. "Sir, do you know her?" David glanced at the woman, whose face was still twisted in pain. He shook his head. "No." The nurse nodded. "You should stay for a few minutes. We might need your statement." He hesitated. His interview, his dream. Then the woman looked up at him again. "You don't have to stay. I'll be fine." David exhaled, glancing at the clock on the wall. 10:12 M. His throat tightened. It was over. His dream job, his chance at stability, gone. Yet, as he looked at the woman he had just helped, something told him he had made the right choice, and what happened next would change his life forever. David stood frozen in the clinic's waiting area, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. The reality of what had just happened sank in slowly, like a cold weight settling over his shoulders. He had missed the interview, months of preparation, the one chance to escape the endless cycle of struggle. It was gone. He let out a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He had to believe that if he did the right thing, good things would come. But right now, that belief felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. The woman he had helped was seated in a chair near the reception desk. She was still wincing in pain as a nurse wrapped a temporary brace around her swollen ankle. Her sharp green eyes flicked toward him, studying him as if she sensed the internal battle he was fighting. "You stayed," she murmured. David forced a small smile. "Didn't feel right to just walk away?" She hesitated, then extended a hand toward him. "I'm Claire." He shook her hand, noticing how soft it was despite the firm grip. David. She opened her mouth to say something else, but a doctor stepped in, cutting their conversation short. Miss Hamilton? Claire straightened slightly. Yes. David barely registered the name. His mind was too busy racing through the consequences of his missed opportunity. The job posting had stated clearly, "Punctuality is key. No late applicants will be considered. There would be no second chances." The doctor took Claire's chart and began his assessment. "It looks like a bad sprain, not a fracture. You'll need to stay off your foot for a few weeks. I'll write you a prescription for painkillers and some crutches." David stepped back, feeling out of place now. He had done what he could. There was no reason to stay any longer. Claire must have sensed it. "Wait!" she called just as he turned. He hesitated. "You didn't have to stop for me," she said. "But you did, and you lost something because of it, didn't you?" David swallowed hard. He wasn't the kind of person who burdened strangers with his problems. But something about Claire's voice, the way she spoke, not just with sympathy, but with understanding, made him answer honestly. "I had a job interview," he admitted. "One I really needed." She frowned. "And you missed it because of me?" He shook his head quickly. "Number, I missed it because I made a choice." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment, something unreadable in her expression. David exhaled. "Look, it's fine. I should get going." "Do you have another job lined up?" she asked abruptly. He hesitated. The answer was no, but admitting that felt too raw. She seemed to understand anyway. "David, let me do something to help." He tensed. The last thing he wanted was charity. "You don't owe me anything." Claire tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Maybe not, but I'd like to." He opened his mouth to protest, but she cut him off. "I own a company. Maybe there's a position that fits your skills." David blinked. "You own a company?" A small, knowing smile played on her lips. "Yes." The pieces clicked together in his mind. Hamilton. The name on the clinic's paperwork. He suddenly recalled seeing the name on a massive skyscraper downtown. Hamilton Enterprises. David's throat went dry. "You're that Claire Hamilton?" She chuckled. "Guilty." His pulse raced. Hamilton Enterprises was one of the biggest firms in the city, known for its innovative business strategies. If she was offering a job, it wasn't just any job. It was the kind of opportunity most people could only dream of. But something about it didn't sit right. "I appreciate it," he said carefully, "but I don't want a handout." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Who said anything about a handout?" David hesitated. She adjusted herself in the chair. "Listen, I don't believe in giving people things they don't earn, but I do believe in rewarding good character. You had no idea who I was, and yet you stopped to help me at the cost of your own opportunity. That says a lot about the kind of person you are." He looked away, unsure how to respond. She reached into her bag and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table. "Come by my office tomorrow. No promises, but let's talk. If there's a position that fits your skills, you'll go through the proper hiring process. No special treatment." David stared at the card. This felt unreal. Moments ago, he had thought the day was a complete disaster. Now, he was being invited to one of the most prestigious offices in the city. But could he trust it? He lifted his gaze back to Claire. Her expression was open, genuine. He could tell she wasn't the type to waste time with empty gestures. After a long pause, he nodded. "Okay, I'll be there." A small smile touched her lips. "Good." David tucked the card into his pocket, his mind still spinning. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain. His life was about to change in ways he never could have imagined. David walked home in a daze, his mind tangled with uncertainty. The small business card in his pocket felt heavier than it should have. as if it carried the weight of something bigger than he could comprehend. Claire Hamilton. The name alone carried power, and yet she had sat there in that clinic, speaking to him like an equal, offering an opportunity that seemed too good to be real. The city lights flickered above him as he navigated the cracked sidewalks of his neighborhood. It wasn't the safest part of town. His apartment was a cramped, one-bedroom space, with paper-thin walls, and a landlord who only fixed things when legally threatened, but it was all he could afford, and even that was becoming difficult with the odd jobs he had been scraping together. As he unlocked his door and stepped inside, he felt the weight of exhaustion settle over him. He dropped his bag on the worn-out couch and ran a hand through his hair. The room was silent except for the distant sound of sirens echoing through the streets. His phone buzzed, a sharp reminder of reality. He pulled it out of his pocket, already knowing what the message would be. "Mr. Carter, we regret to inform you that due to your absence, we have moved forward with other candidates." David exhaled slowly, pressing the phone against his forehead. He had expected this, but seeing it in writing stung. That job had been his best shot at stability. Now it was gone. His eyes flickered to the business card again. Could he really trust Claire Hamilton? Was this truly a chance, or just a wealthy woman's momentary guilt? He shook his head. There was no use overthinking it. He had nothing left to lose. The next morning, David dressed in his best shirt, one that had seen too many laundromat cycles but was still presentable, and made his way downtown. The contrast between his world and Claire's became painfully evident the closer he got to the towering skyscrapers of the business district. Men and women in tailored suits hurried past him, their eyes fixed on their phones, their steps purposeful. He felt out of place. When he reached Hamilton Enterprises, he hesitated. The building loomed above him, its sleek glass exterior reflecting the morning sun. He stepped inside, feeling the air conditioning hit him like a wave, cooling the sweat forming on his palms. The lobby was a world of polished marble floors, high ceilings, and crisp professionalism. A receptionist with a sharp bob and an even sharper gaze looked up at him. "Can I help you?" David cleared his throat. I have a meeting with Claire Hamilton." Her brow lifted slightly, but she typed something into her computer. "Your name?" "David Carter." A beat of silence. Then, to his surprise, she nodded. "You're expected. Take the elevator to the 32nd floor." David blinked. He had been sure he'd arrive only to be told Claire was unavailable, or that there had been a mistake. But no, he was really being given a chance. The elevator ride was long, and with each passing floor, his nerves built. When the doors opened, he stepped into a space that was even more intimidating than the lobby. The floor-to-ceiling windows provided a breathtaking view of the city, and everything from the modern furniture to the subtle scent of expensive cologne screamed power and success. A woman approached him, tall, with a no-nonsense air about her. "You must be David." He nodded. "Yes." "I'm Julia, Miss Hamilton's assistant. Follow me." She led him down a hallway lined with offices, each occupied by professionals who barely glanced up from their work. When they reached the last door, Julia opened it and motioned for him to step inside. Claire was seated at a large desk, her foot propped up on a cushioned stool. The difference in her demeanor was striking. Gone was the vulnerable woman from the clinic. In her place was a CEO in full control of her domain. David felt like an intruder. "David," she greeted him with a small smile. "I'm glad you came." He swallowed. "I almost didn't." Her smile widened slightly. "I figured." Julia placed a file on Claire's desk and left, closing the door behind her. Claire gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit." David did. She studied him for a moment. "Before we talk about anything, I want to be clear. This is not charity. I don't hand out jobs to people out of guilt or pity." He nodded stiffly. "I wouldn't want that anyway." "Good." She leaned forward slightly. "I looked into you last night." David's stomach twisted. "Looked into me?" She nodded. "I'm not in the habit of offering opportunities to complete strangers without knowing who they are. I found your resume, your job applications, your history." His jaw clenched. He didn't like the idea of someone digging into his struggles. Claire must have noticed his discomfort because she softened slightly. "You've been trying, hard, but life hasn't made it easy for you." He said nothing. She continued, flipping through the file. "You have experience in logistics and operations. You've worked at warehouses, managed inventory, handled supply chain coordination. Am I right?" He nodded. "I have a department that could use someone like you," she said simply. "Not as a favor, but because I believe in hiring people with integrity, and yesterday you showed me you have it." David's head spun. This was happening too fast. "What's the catch?" he asked, his voice rough. Claire tilted her head. "No catch. Just expectations. You'll be held to the same standards as everyone else. You'll have to prove yourself. Are you willing to do that?" He exhaled slowly. "Yes." A small smile played on her lips. "Then welcome to Hamilton Enterprises, David." For the first time in years, he felt something stir in his chest. Hope. David sat frozen in the chair across from Claire Hamilton, struggling to absorb what had just happened. A job, an actual opportunity, had been handed to him, but not out of pity. Claire had made that clear. She wasn't offering him a handout. She saw potential in him. But was he ready? Could he really step into a corporate environment so far removed from the world he had known? His fingers curled slightly against the armrest of the chair. He'd spent years bouncing from one labor-intensive job to another, working warehouse shifts, lifting heavy crates, organizing deliveries, and taking orders from supervisors who barely acknowledged his existence. Now he was being offered a position at Hamilton Enterprises, a place where suits and polished shoes were the norm, where people carried leather briefcases instead of worn-out tool belts. Claire watched him closely, her expression unreadable. "You look unsure." David exhaled, running a hand over his face. "I guess I am. This isn't the kind of job I ever thought I'd get." She leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers lightly on the desk. "You think you don't belong here?" He hesitated before nodding. "I'm not like the people who work here." Claire arched an eyebrow. "And what makes you think that?" David let out a dry chuckle, gesturing to his worn-out shirt and scuffed shoes. "Look at me. I barely had enough money to take the subway here. I've never worked in an office before. I don't even know where to start." Claire's gaze didn't waver. "That's fair, but let me ask you something. Do you think every successful person in this building was born with a silver spoon? Do you think I was?" David hesitated. He had assumed Claire came from wealth. Her confidence, her presence, the way she carried herself screamed privilege. She smirked as if reading his mind. "I wasn't. My father built this company from the ground up, and I watched him struggle. We weren't poor, but we weren't rich either. He worked hard, made sacrifices, and taught me that success isn't about where you start. It's about where you're willing to go." David swallowed hard. "You made a choice yesterday," she continued. "You put someone else's life before your own ambitions. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. You might not have worked in an office before, but you understand responsibility, hard work, and sacrifice. That's more valuable to me than any fancy degree." David looked down, his mind still racing. Could he do this? Could he step into this new world and prove himself? Claire gave him a moment before she leaned forward, clasping her hands together. "Here's the deal. You start on Monday. You'll report to the logistics department where you'll be working under my operations manager. Your role will involve inventory coordination, shipping oversight, and streamlining processes. It won't be glamorous, but it'll be real work, and if you prove yourself, there's room to grow. David's breath caught. It was happening. But let me be clear, Claire added, her expression serious. I don't believe in second chances when it comes to business. If you take this job, I expect you to show up, give it your all, and not waste the opportunity. Do you understand? David nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling in. I understand. She extended her hand. Then it's official. Welcome to Hamilton Enterprises. He hesitated for a second before gripping her hand. It was firm, steady, just like her. When he left the office, his mind was still reeling. The elevator ride down felt surreal, as if he were watching his own life from the outside. The moment he stepped outside, the noise of the city hit him full force. The blaring horns, the rush of people, the distant hum of street performers playing for loose change. He pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. There was one person he needed to call. Mom? His voice was shaky as he pressed the phone to his ear. David? His mother's voice was warm but laced with worry. You okay? David let out a shaky breath. I got a job. A pause, then, oh honey, that's wonderful. He smiled, his chest tightening. Yeah, it's a big one, Mom. It's not like anything I've done before. You always sell yourself short, David, she said gently. You're stronger than you think. You deserve this. He closed his eyes, letting her words wash over him. The next few days were a blur of preparation. David went to a thrift store and bought the best dress shirt and slacks he could afford. He practiced tying a tie, watching YouTube tutorials late into the night. He studied logistics terms, trying to familiarize himself with what he would be working on. And then, Monday arrived. David stood in front of the Hamilton Enterprises building, his heart pounding. The glass doors reflected his image back at him, an ordinary man about to step into an extraordinary opportunity. Taking a deep breath, he walked inside. The logistics department was a sprawling floor of desks, computers, and whiteboards filled with shipment schedules. The operations manager, a stern-looking man named Tom Whitaker, greeted him with a curt nod. You must be Carter, Tom said, handing him a clipboard. No time for hand-holding here. You'll be shadowing me for the first few days, learning the ropes. After that, I expect you to keep up. David nodded, gripping the clipboard tightly. I'll do my best. Tom gave him a long look before nodding. Good, let's get started. The first day was overwhelming. He had to learn fast, how to track shipments, update inventory records, communicate with suppliers. There were moments of doubt, times he felt like he was drowning in information. But he refused to give up. By the end of the first week, Tom pulled him aside. You're picking things up faster than I expected. David let out a breath of relief. I'm trying. Tom smirked. Keep trying. We'll see what you're really made of soon enough. David nodded, determination burning in his chest. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he believed he had a chance. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest David had ever faced. The world of logistics was brutal. Constant deadlines, unexpected shipping delays, and demanding clients who had no patience for mistakes. Every day, he walked into Hamilton Enterprises, determined to prove himself. But the learning curve was steep. Tom Whitaker, his direct supervisor, was a no-nonsense man who barely acknowledged David's presence unless it was to point out an error. Wrong entry, Tom would say, tapping his pen against the screen when David logged shipment details incorrectly. If this goes through, we lose money. Pay attention. David would grit his teeth and nod. Got it. Mistakes weren't tolerated here, and he knew it. But quitting wasn't an option. He stayed late every night, studying shipment reports, memorizing vendor names, and learning how to anticipate problems before they happened. His only goal was survival, to keep up, to avoid failure. Then, 3 weeks into the job, something happened that changed everything. It was a Friday evening, and David was the last person in the department. He was reviewing the schedule for a major shipment set to depart on Monday when he noticed an inconsistency. The system showed that 500 units of high-value electronics were being sent to a distribution center in Chicago. But something wasn't right. The inventory logs from the warehouse listed only 350 units available. David frowned, double-checking the numbers. The mistake wasn't his, but it was significant. If no one caught it before the shipment left, the company could face serious financial losses, not to mention potential legal trouble for a contractual breach. His heart pounded. Should he flag it? Would Tom even listen? Swallowing his doubt, David took a deep breath and picked up the phone. "Tom, it's David." A pause. Then, "Why are you calling me at this hour?" "I found a discrepancy in the Chicago shipment." He quickly explained what he had discovered. There was silence on the other end. Then Tom exhaled sharply. "You're sure about this?" "Yes, I triple-checked." Another pause. Then, "Stay there. I'm coming in." David sat at his desk, nerves buzzing. Within 20 minutes, Tom arrived, still in his wrinkled dress shirt from earlier that day. He walked over, glanced at the screen, and within seconds, his face darkened. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. He pulled up additional records, cross-referencing the shipment order with the warehouse logs. After several tense minutes, he slammed his palm on the desk. "You just saved us from a massive screw-up." David blinked. "I did?" Tom leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face. "Yeah, this would have been a disaster if it went through. If you hadn't caught it, we'd be short 150 units and on the hook for thousands in penalties." David's stomach twisted. Was it my mistake?" Tom gave him a hard look. "Number it was someone higher up in procurement who entered the wrong inventory numbers. But the fact that you caught it, that's impressive." For the first time, Tom didn't sound condescending. There was something else in his tone. Respect. "Good work, Carter." David felt something stir inside him. Pride. He had done something right. The next Monday, Claire Hamilton herself showed up in the logistics department. The employees straightened in their chairs, whispering among themselves. David tried to stay focused on his work, but then he heard his name. "David, my office, now." His stomach tightened as he followed Claire up to the executive floor. He had barely spoken to her since the day she had hired him, and now he was being summoned. Was he in trouble? The second they stepped into her office, Claire shut the door and turned to him. "I heard what you did," David swallowed. "Tom told you?" "Yes, and I have to say, I'm impressed." She gestured for him to sit. "You caught an issue that others overlooked, people who have been here for years. That says a lot about how seriously you take your work." David wasn't sure how to respond. I just didn't want to mess up." Claire smiled slightly. "You didn't mess up. You proved something." There was a pause before she leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "How would you feel about a promotion?" David's breath hitched. What?" "A position as an assistant logistics coordinator. It comes with a higher salary, better benefits, and more responsibility." His heart pounded in his chest. "You really think I'm ready for that?" Claire studied him for a long moment. "Do you?" David's mind raced back to the doubts he had when he first walked into this building. He had been convinced he didn't belong here, that this world was too far from the one he had always known. But now he wasn't so sure. Finally, he took a deep breath and met her gaze. Yes, I think I am. A slow smile spread across Claire's lips. Good answer. That night, David sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone. He needed to call his mom and tell her the news. He needed to let himself believe that this was real. He had missed a job interview that day on the road, the interview he thought would change his life. But maybe, just maybe, fate had led him to something even greater. David sat in his small apartment, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on him. The reality of his promotion hadn't fully sunk in yet. He had gone from being just another desperate job seeker to earning a real position at one of the most powerful logistics firms in the country. It felt unreal. His phone buzzed beside him. He picked it up, heart pounding when he saw his mother's name. He had been meaning to call her all day. "Hey, Ma," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "David." Her relief was evident. "I was starting to worry. How have you been? Did you find anything yet?" He exhaled, gripping the phone tighter. "Yeah, Ma, I got a job." There was silence on the other end, and then a sharp intake of breath. "You did?" "I did, at Hamilton Enterprises." "The Hamilton Company?" she asked, voice rising. "The one in the news all the time?" He chuckled. "Yeah, that one." "Oh, David, that's wonderful." His mother's voice cracked with emotion. "I knew you'd find something. I was praying for you, mi hijo. Tell me everything." And so he did. He told her about the rainy day on the road, about helping Claire, about how he had lost his interview, but ended up being hired by the very woman he had saved. He told her about the struggles, about Tom's harsh supervision, about the mistake he caught that earned him recognition. When he finished, his mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said softly, "You see, mijo? God always has a plan. You thought you lost an opportunity that day, but he had something greater in store for you." David swallowed hard, emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He had spent years believing that life was just a series of hardships, that no matter how hard he worked, people like him were always stuck, struggling. But maybe, just maybe, his mother was right. Over the next few months, David poured everything into his new role. He learned quickly, adapting to the fast-paced environment of corporate logistics. Tom, who had once barely acknowledged him, began seeking his input on shipments. Other employees took notice of his work ethic, his attention to detail. He wasn't just another employee anymore. He was someone people respected. But despite his success, one thing still weighed on his mind: Claire Hamilton. Since his promotion, she had remained professional, cordial but distant. Their conversations were strictly work-related, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was holding back. He wasn't sure why it bothered him so much. Maybe it was because he had seen a different side of her that night on the road. The vulnerable woman who had been lost, afraid. That version of Claire had felt real. Then, one evening, everything changed. David was leaving the office late, the building nearly empty, when he spotted Claire standing by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows in the executive lounge. She was staring out at the city skyline, a glass of something dark in her hand. He hesitated. He could leave, pretend he hadn't seen her, but something told him not to. Taking a deep breath, he walked over. "Long day?" Claire turned slightly, startled, then relaxed when she saw him. "Something like that." David stood beside her, looking out at the city lights. "You okay?" She sighed, swirling the liquid in her glass. "Do you ever feel like no matter how much you achieve, it's never enough?" David glanced at her, surprised by the question. "All the time." She let out a small laugh. "Yeah, I figured." They stood in silence for a moment before she spoke again. "You know, when my father passed, everyone expected me to take over without question. But I was never sure if this was what I wanted. I've spent years trying to prove I deserve to be here. David studied her profile, the way her jaw tensed slightly as she spoke. You do deserve it. She turned to him, her blue eyes locking onto his. And what about you, David? Do you think you deserve to be here? He thought about that. A year ago, he would have said no. But now he had earned his place. I think, he said slowly, that sometimes life puts you exactly where you're meant to be, even if you don't see it at first. Claire held his gaze for a long moment, something unreadable passing through her expression. Then she smiled, a genuine, real smile. You really are something, David Carter. He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, well, I try. She took a deep breath, then reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, a keycard. She held it out to him. What's this? He asked. Your new office. His breath hitched. Claire, Don't argue, she said, smirking. I don't hand out promotions on a whim. You earned it. He hesitated, then took the keycard, the weight of it sinking in. This wasn't just another job anymore. This was a future. Claire tilted her head slightly. You know, David, I never actually got to thank you for that night. He smiled. You already did. She raised an eyebrow. Not properly. Before he could respond, she extended her hand. Not as his boss, not as the CEO of Hamilton Enterprises, but as someone who truly saw him. David shook it, feeling something shift between them. As he walked away that night, he realized something. Sometimes life changes in an instant. Sometimes the opportunities you think you lost lead you to something far greater. And sometimes saving a stranger on the road doesn't just change their life, it changes yours. Thank you for watching Stories of Hope. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more inspiring real-life stories.